The film opens up with a young doctor named Elizabeth dreaming about sitting in a garden when suddenly her colleague wakes her up. She immediately asks how long she was out, and her colleague replies that she was only asleep for 6 minutes. Elizabeth pours herself a coffee as a senior doctor walks into the staff room and asks how long she's been working. Elizabeth responds with 23, and the senior doctor is shocked, telling Elizabeth that she needs to go, though Elizabeth refuses, as going home won't get her an attending spot. Elizabeth rushes to her patient, who is an elderly man on morphine. Elizabeth asks the gentleman if there's anything she can do for him, and he replies that she can marry him. Elizabeth laughs off the old man's comments and walks away, handing a colleague the man's file. Throughout the day, Elizabeth tends to many patients, dealing with the different issues they're suffering with, and drinking lots and lots of coffee. Elizabeth ends up taking a bathroom break and freshens herself up, while other co-workers are in the women's bathroom doing the same. Her senior, Fran, is applying cream under her eyelids to get rid of black circles, and another colleague comments that Fran has a date tonight, much to Fran's dismay. The rest of her colleagues complain about their personal lives, husbands, kids, etc., as they comment how lucky Elizabeth is, that all she has to worry about is work. Elizabeth just nods her head while applying lipstick, seemingly hurt by the comment. Just then, a co-worker calls her out of the bathroom to show her an X-ray. Elizabeth notes that there is no fracture, and that the patient should be sent home. Just then, Elizabeth's phone rings and it's her sister Abby calling her. Abby informs Elizabeth that she has set her up with a date tonight, to which Elizabeth replies by saying that she is perfectly capable of speaking to men herself. Abby says that she wants her to speak to a man that isn't bleeding, to which Elizabeth replies that she's actually received 3 marriage proposals already today, but both sisters know she's joking. Reluctantly, Elizabeth does accept to meet the man that Abby has set her up with. Elizabeth walks down the ward and is stopped by another senior doctor, Dr. Walsh, who asks her how long she's been in shift, to which she tells him that she's been on longer than 12 hours. Dr. Walsh informs her that he has made his decision, and that he wants her to stay on as an attending physician. Elizabeth is full of joy at hearing she has got the attending position, and even ends up hugging Dr. Walsh. Elizabeth tries to go back to her patients, but is stopped by Dr. Walsh, who tells her to go home, as she has been working for 26 hours. In the parking lot, Elizabeth runs into Dr. Brett, a fellow doctor who was also in the running for the attending physician position that's just been given to Elizabeth. Elizabeth apologizes to Dr. Brett, who assures it's okay, as he has been offered a position in Phoenix. As she's driving to her date, Elizabeth calls Abby and tells her that she's going to be late for her date, though she's landed the attending physician role. Abby is delighted and informs Elizabeth that her date is late also. Elizabeth hangs up and turns the radio up. She's distracted for a split second, but suddenly a truck comes speeding towards her car. David, a single man looking for an apartment in the area, is being shown around several apartments by his real estate agent. David is clearly indecisive and a man of few words, as he keeps turning his nose up on all the apartments he's being shown, finding issues with the smallest of features. The agent soon gives up and tells David that maybe he should take a break from looking at apartments for a short while, and start again when he's ready. The agent also asks him if everything is okay with family and in his personal life, and David sharply responds that he doesn't want to talk about it. As the two of them are standing outside an apartment building talking, a piece of paper that is being carried off by the wind lands on David's face. Coincidentally, the paper has the details of a sublet, one which is just across the street from where he's standing. David ends up viewing the apartment, and is fairly impressed. The agent even states that she's surprised that the apartment is available, but does say that the owners are selling it due to personal issues. David looks around, and even goes up to the roof, where the view is magnificent, though he pays no attention to the view and begins watering the plants. The agent notes how incredible the view is, and is surprised that an apartment like this is even available. David walks back down to the apartment, and the agent follows, noting that he likes the couch, and ends up taking the apartment. David spends his nights alone in the apartment, drinking beer constantly and only eating takeout food. David is watching what seems to be a wedding video as he takes out another beer from the fridge, when he turns around, and is in shock at Elizabeth standing there. Elizabeth and David both scream as David sprays her with beer. Elizabeth pleads with him to not attack her, as she has no money, and that she'll take him to a homeless shelter, confusing David. Now confused more than ever, David assures her that he's not homeless, and that he does in fact live in this apartment. Elizabeth, however, condescendingly explains that he can't live there, as this is her apartment. David is confused, but he believes this may be a rent scam, and that they've both been tricked by the owners to take rent from both of them. Elizabeth disagrees. She goes on to further explain how she owns all the furniture, and that David will clean the mess he has made. Elizabeth storms into the kitchen while calling David a pig, and David follows her, but is surprised to see Elizabeth has disappeared. The next day, David fits a lock on his door, determined to keep out intruders like Elizabeth. He takes a shower, but when he gets out and looks in the mirror, he can see Elizabeth yelling at him to get out of her apartment. David is startled, though when he looks behind him, There is no one there. Later that night, David is with his friend Jack at a cafe. David doesn't hesitate and tells Jack that he's been seeing a woman, which Jack thinks means his friend has been dating. David clears up Jack's misconception and explains that he's been seeing a woman in his apartment that isn't supposed to be there, a hallucination. Jack asks David if he's been drinking, and David admits he has. Jack is disappointed and tries to convince David to only drink in social situations, which David agrees to. Back at the apartment, David cracks open a beer, has a shower, and is delighted to realize he hasn't seen Elizabeth in a while. David goes to bed, but suddenly is woken up by Elizabeth, who threatens to call the police as he still hasn't left her apartment. David asks her to leave him alone and tries to convince himself that she doesn't exist. Instead, Elizabeth goes full doctor mode and starts asking him a series of medical questions, as she believes that David has gotten drunk to the point of convincing himself that he owns an already owned apartment. Elizabeth informs David that he may be mentally ill, and David even starts beginning to believe her. The situation for David is now turning on its head, as he is now doubting whether or not he's sane. Elizabeth goes on to explain that everything in the apartment is hers, and even a picture on the dresser, which isn't there. Furious, Elizabeth asks where the picture is, as it is missing. David tries to explain that there wasn't a picture there when he moved in, but Elizabeth heads for the phone, telling him she's calling the police. However, when she tries to grab the phone, her hand goes through it. Elizabeth asks David what he has done with her phone, and David shakes his head as she storms out of the room, wanting to use the one in the kitchen, but she disappears before his eyes. The next day, David calls his agent and inquires about the owners, asking her if he can get their contact details. His agent asks why he wants this information, and David replies that he wants to know about the previous tenant. The agent informs David that may be difficult, as she asked herself, and the owners didn't want to talk about it, as it was a tragic event in the family. David asks if the previous tenant lost their life, and the agent tells him that may be the case. David takes a trip to the occult bookstore, and there, he meets a young man named Daryl, who helps him select the right books in order to get rid of a spirit lingering in his home. Later that night, David puts into practice what he has read and attempts to summon Elizabeth's spirit again. David chants some words, and initially, Elizabeth doesn't appear, though he then threatens to rest a coffee mug on the mahogany table without a coaster, and she suddenly appears. David asks Elizabeth if she has noticed anything unusual about herself recently, and she replies that he's the only thing out of place she's noticed recently, completely forgetting that she was unable to pick up the phone earlier. David then asks her if she knows her name, to which Elizabeth pauses, looks around, and sees the mug with her name on it. She then responds to David's question, almost as if she needed something to remind her of her own name. David then further interrogates her, asking her when's the last time she remembers talking to someone other than David, and what she does during the day. Elizabeth can't give him a straight answer. David then tries to persuade her to accept the fact that she's no longer alive, though she cannot accept it, and is adamant that she is. David urges Elizabeth to walk into the light, though she keeps iterating the belief that she's not deceased, until just then, she realizes she is standing inside the dining table. Elizabeth, frustrated, attempts to slap David, but is unable to touch him. After that fails, she attempts to push him, telling him to get out, though she ends up falling out of the apartment and out the window. David says rest in peace as Elizabeth falls out, but as soon as he turns around, he's startled by Elizabeth already back, firmly telling him that she isn't leaving. Over the next several days, David tries everything to get rid of Elizabeth's spirit from the apartment, from exorcism to even hiring a group of men that think they're real-life Ghostbusters. Ultimately, they all fail, and are unable to even see Elizabeth, who is amused as she watches their failed attempts at getting rid of her. Finally, David invites over Daryl from the occult bookstore. Daryl states that he senses an angry spirit, and Elizabeth is even impressed, stating that she believes Daryl actually has a gift. Daryl advises David to move away from the apartment, much to Elizabeth's delight, though David is adamant that he will not be moving. Daryl is confused, as he can't see the appeal of the apartment. But both Elizabeth and David begin listing all the apartment's attractive features, though Daryl is still not impressed and asks for a drink. Daryl is standing in the kitchen, downing a can of Diet Cola in one go, and David continues to ask him questions. David asks Daryl if he can just persuade Elizabeth to pass on, but Elizabeth hears this and mocks him. Elizabeth snaps at David that none of this is easy on her, and Daryl also begrudgingly states that he doesn't think he can help David, as this is one of the most alive spirits that he's ever encountered, and she's clearly not going anywhere. Daryl further explains that he also doesn't think that Elizabeth's deceased, much to David's confusion. Before Daryl takes his leave, he states that the aura he senses from David is the darkest he's ever come across, and that he needs to let her go. David is confused by this, and reiterates that he wants to let her go, but she doesn't want to leave. Daryl clears up David's confusion and tells him he's not referring to Elizabeth, but rather the girl that broke David's heart. Elizabeth laughs and exclaims that David got dumped, though David is not happy, and he says that he doesn't want to talk about it. David snaps at Elizabeth, firmly telling her to shut up as he walks away from both Daryl and Elizabeth. David goes up onto the rooftop to get some fresh air and to get away from Elizabeth's mocking. Elizabeth follows him, apologizes for her behavior, and asks him if he wants to talk about it. David again shouts, firmly telling her that he doesn't want to talk about it. Elizabeth doesn't take offense, stating that she is aware that anger is a common reaction to loss. Elizabeth asks David the name of the woman he is grieving over, and he tells her that her name was Laura, and that she was his wife. After revealing this to Elizabeth, David heads out to a bar, but before he can enter, Elizabeth tries to stop him. Elizabeth expresses her concern for David and his alcohol dependency, though David doesn't care, and goes in to meet his friend Jack, who is delighted to see that David has made an appearance. Jack asks David what he's having to drink, and Elizabeth quickly answers coffee, but of course, Jack cannot hear or see her, and then David asks for scotch. Elizabeth firmly explains to David that he cannot drink his feelings away, and David smugly replies that she can watch him do so. Just as David goes for the glass of scotch, Elizabeth attempts to take over his body to stop him, and they both struggle to overpower the other as Jack watches on, bewildered. Elizabeth ends up controlling David's body, spills the scotch on a lady friend of Jack's, and then forces David out of the bar. David is anything but happy, though Elizabeth is adamant that he'll thank her for this one day. David storms off and sits on a park bench to calm down. Though as he turns around, he is disappointed to see that Elizabeth is also sitting there next to him. David angrily asks her why she's still there, though Elizabeth cannot give him an answer. Elizabeth reveals to him that she's scared that she may actually be deceased, and that she feels as if she doesn't exist unless she's with David. David, who has now calmed down, apologizes that he called her a ghost. Elizabeth says that she cannot remember a single thing about herself, and asks David to help her recall her life. David scoffs in response to this. Elizabeth explains to him that he can choose to accept one of two realities. Either a woman has come into his life that needs his help, or he is insane, and is right now sitting alone on a park bench at night talking to himself. David reluctantly agrees to help her, as the first reality is much more appealing to him. The next day, David and Elizabeth go door to door in the apartment building, asking their neighbors if any of them knew the tenant that lived in the apartment before David. None of the neighbors seem to know who the previous tenant was, some even go as far as to claim that no one lived there at all. David and Elizabeth then knock on the door of an apartment, and a young woman who introduces herself as Katrina answers the door. Katrina invites David in, though David declines, asking her if could ask her a quick question in relation to the previous tenant of his apartment. Katrina says that she does think that someone lived there, but the person was antisocial. Katrina calls the previous tenant a cat lady, without cats. David is amused by this, though Elizabeth is not. Katrina asks David if he can take a look at her window, which is faulty, though Elizabeth sees through this as a ploy by Katrina to seduce David. David refuses Katrina's offer, using the excuse that he has dinner plans, and Elizabeth is disgusted by Katrina as the pair walk away. As they're walking back to their apartment, Elizabeth continues to complain about Katrina, though David isn't happy that he had to reject Katrina's advances. Elizabeth tries to persuade him that Katrina lacks class, though David doesn't care. Elizabeth continues to slander Katrina, almost as if she's jealous. David marches over to the fridge, where he takes out a beer bottle. As he's looking for the bottle opener, he finds a note with contact details for dry cleaners. David and Elizabeth arrive at the dry cleaners, where David asks the shop owner if he remembers the woman that picked up the order on the note. The dry cleaner states that he does indeed remember her, and that she looked sad and lonely, though Elizabeth is not happy, stating she doesn't need a psychological evaluation. The owner doesn't know more than this, so Elizabeth and David take their leave. David and Elizabeth notice that there is also an address written on the note, and decide to head over there. Once there, David asks Elizabeth if she recognizes the property, which she denies. David rings the doorbell and a middle-aged man answers the door, who is confused to see a stranger arrive at his home. David asks the man if he knows a young blonde woman. The man immediately looks panicked, asking David if his wife put him up to this. Elizabeth now looks horrified, and just then a woman from inside the house calls out to the man, who tells David to come back at 6 p.m., and shuts the door. David, now smirking, looks at Elizabeth, who immediately tells him that she never had sex with the man who opened the door. David, however, doesn't care, as he believes he's coming into some money now. While in the car, Elizabeth begins to have doubts that maybe she was indeed a homewrecker. David and Elizabeth then arrive outside a restaurant, while Elizabeth tries persuading David, though mostly herself, that there is nothing wrong with being promiscuous. David agrees, but just then Elizabeth recognizes the restaurant they're standing outside. Elizabeth immediately states that the restaurant's name is Moose's, though she has never actually eaten there. Disappointed, the pair are about to walk out the door, but just then a man collapses, and the restaurant workers call for a doctor. Elizabeth, watching on, tells David to feel the man's chest to check if he's bloated, which confuses David, but he does so after Elizabeth shouts at him to do what she tells him to. Elizabeth immediately knows what to do, instructing David to take some vodka and a knife and make an incision in the man's abdomen. David is horrified at the suggestion, though eventually does as she says. The man begins to breathe, and the restaurant owner shakes David's hand. Now Elizabeth has realized that she is a doctor and remembers that she worked at a hospital near the area named St. Matthew's. David and Elizabeth head over to St. Matthew's, and Elizabeth confirms that she did indeed work there, and she begins naming the hospital staff she knew. David goes up to the receptionist, who according to Elizabeth, is named Anita. David inquires about a doctor named Elizabeth, and Anita asks if he means Elizabeth Masterson, and Elizabeth confirms that is her full name. Though Anita doesn't look happy to hear this, as she explains that Dr. Masterson is no longer active at the hospital. Anita speaks to a colleague, then instructs David to go up to the 3rd floor, as her colleague will be able to answer any questions. Once David and Elizabeth get up to the 3rd floor, and David is greeted by Elizabeth's old colleague, Fran. Fran asks David what he wants to know in regards to Elizabeth Masterson, though she would like to know his relationship with her first. Elizabeth instructs David to tell her that he was her boyfriend, though David is hesitant to say this. Fran laughs, as she finds it hard to believe that Elizabeth had a boyfriend, as her whole life was her work. David is confused as to what to say next, but he sticks with his story, and even states that he's now living in her old apartment. Fran asks if he knows about her accident, and suddenly, it all comes back to Elizabeth. Fran explains to David that Elizabeth's accident was 3 months ago. David apologizes as Elizabeth has her attention diverted to a door at the end of the corridor. Elizabeth walks into the room where she sees herself lying in the bed, unconscious and on life support. David is very confused at seeing Elizabeth's body and Elizabeth's spirit standing in the room together, though he is relieved to see that they've finally solved the mystery. Elizabeth is not happy at all, though, as she knows that a 3-month-long coma means that she's in a long-term coma. David tries to cheer her up by explaining that it's better than being deceased. Elizabeth tries to go back into her body, and David notes that her vital signs on the monitor also go up as she does it, though Elizabeth states that she can't stay in her body for some reason. Just then, Fran comes in and informs David that he cannot stay much longer, as she has patients to attend to, and he cannot be there alone. David takes his leave, though Elizabeth decides to stay. Later, Elizabeth overhears Fran's conversation with a colleague about David, and how she feels sorry for Elizabeth, that just when she finally found someone, she got into an accident. Elizabeth walks around her old workplace, recognizing colleagues and people she spent time with. Eventually, she walks into Dr. Brett's office, who ended up taking the job she was offered after she fell into a coma. Elizabeth is unimpressed with Dr. Brett, as he spends his time lounging in his office rather than helping patients. As Elizabeth walks out of Dr. Brett's office, she spots her niece and nephew running down the corridor, into the room where her body is. Elizabeth chases after them, though they are unable to see or hear her, as is her sister, Abby, who has come to visit her. Just then, Dr. Brett walks into the room and asks Abby if he can speak to her. Elizabeth immediately knows what Dr. Brett wants to speak about, and Dr. Brett explains to Abby that they may have to soon make the difficult decision to turn off Elizabeth's life support. Elizabeth pleads with her sister to not listen to Dr. Brett, and Abby leaves, telling Dr. Brett that she'll think about it before giving an answer, as the hospital cannot take any action without the consent of Elizabeth's family. David is back at his apartment. He calls out to Elizabeth and gets no answer. As he's drinking a glass of water, he remembers to place a coaster to not damage the table, as Elizabeth always told him to do. Just then the doorbell goes, and Katrina has arrived, claiming that she has been locked out of her apartment. Katrina is extremely chatty. She spends the night just telling David her life story. David, however, begins getting tired, asking if the locksmith knows where to call. Katrina gets up and tells him that she needs to use the bathroom, and just then, Elizabeth appears. David is startled, asking Elizabeth what she's doing back. Katrina calls out to David from the bathroom, and Elizabeth hears her and looks at David in disgust. David tries to explain himself, though Elizabeth is having none of it. Katrina comes out of the room in nothing but a towel and asks David who he was speaking to, though David denies that he was doing so. Katrina explains that she's been interested in David, as she believes that he's lonely just like her, and Elizabeth begins feeling sorry for her. Elizabeth gives permission for David to be with Katrina, noting that Katrina is beautiful, and that David wants to be with her, though David quickly denies this. Elizabeth leaves him with Katrina, though David continues to shout her name, which makes Katrina confused, though not turned off. Elizabeth is sitting on the rooftop, and eventually David joins her, clarifying that nothing happened. Elizabeth asks what he said to Katrina, and David replies that he told her that he was seeing someone, jokingly adding that he's the only one who can see her. David opens up to Elizabeth about his previous wife, recalling that her name was Laura, and one day she went through a cerebral hemorrhage, which was fatal. David notes that he was unable to help her, and didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. She was immediately gone. David states that he thinks of her all the time, but then changes the subject, asking Elizabeth if she thinks her sister would sign the papers to turn off her life support. Elizabeth is unsure and states that her brain activity is decreasing every day, to which David jokes that eventually she'll be at his level. The next day, the pair arrive at an estate. Elizabeth is concerned whether they're trespassing, though David reassures her that the owners are away. They go around the back into a large garden, and David reveals that he was the one who built this, as he owned a landscaping company before his wife passed. Elizabeth is in awe, as this garden looks strikingly similar to the one she was dreaming about at the start of the movie. Just then, David's phone rings. He answers, and it's his estate agent congratulating him, because the owners of the apartment have agreed to a long-term lease. His agent explains that they have agreed to this as the previous tenant is in a coma, and they've now decided to pull the plug on her life support. David hangs up the phone and immediately asks Elizabeth if they could go see her sister. As they're driving over to her sister's home, David asks Elizabeth if she could tell him something about her sister to make her believe their story. Elizabeth replies that Abby kissed her ex-boyfriend on the night of her wedding, and that she's the only one other than Abby that knows. Once they arrive at Abby's home, David attempts to explain the relationship between himself and Elizabeth, though he struggles to do so, as Abby knows that Elizabeth didn't have a boyfriend. David tries to persuade Abby, though she explains to David that he's too late as she's signed the papers, and that they're going to take Elizabeth off life support tomorrow at noon. Abby breaks down in tears and states that for the first time in her life, she's going to respect her sister's wishes. David ends up resorting to trying to explain the truth. Abby is bewildered and unsure what David is talking about. Abby immediately takes her kids into the next room, takes a cleaver, and threatens David to get out of her house. David then resorts to revealing to Abby that he is aware that she kissed her boyfriend on the night of her wedding, though this just makes Abby madder, and she ends up chasing a screaming David out of her house. As soon as David exits, Abby checks up on her kids, though her youngest daughter, Lily, asks when her Aunt Elizabeth is next coming to tea. Abby is in shock that David might have been telling the truth. Later, David and Elizabeth are at a park, and Elizabeth asks David not to hold a grudge against Abby for trying to hack him up with a cleaver, as she was just being a good mother. David is very understanding about the situation. He thinks that Elizabeth would have been a good mother too. David expresses his desire not to give up on reviving Elizabeth, even though she has accepted defeat, as the only person who can see her other than David is her 4-year-old niece. This immediately makes David realize that there is in fact someone else that can see Elizabeth. David and Elizabeth arrive at the occult bookstore, where Daryl immediately realizes that David is still walking around with Elizabeth. David explains the situation to Daryl, who responds by asking if Daryl and Elizabeth are now socializing. Daryl goes on to reveal to David that Elizabeth has feelings for him, which Elizabeth immediately denies, though Daryl can sense that she's giving off an aura of embarrassment. David ignores this and asks Daryl how they get Elizabeth's spirit back into her body, as she's not deceased, just comatose, though Daryl isn't sure. Daryl explains that he's had a gift to sense spirits all his life, but David doesn't have this gift, so it is unusual that he can see Elizabeth in the first place. This intrigues David, and as Elizabeth and David arrive back at their apartment, David continues to ask himself why he can see Elizabeth. David goes through the occult books he obtained from Daryl earlier, but just then, Elizabeth spots a picture frame that Abby put in her hospital room of the sisters together. Elizabeth questions why the picture is in the apartment, and David admits he took it as he wanted a picture to remember Elizabeth if they are unable to save her. David sits down next to Elizabeth as she explains the story behind the picture. Elizabeth reveals that the burning paper in her hand was her MCAT scores, which she failed, and Abby convinced her to burn them and go out and drink margaritas with her. Elizabeth begins to cry, remembering how she wasted her life by just getting stuck at work all day. David tries comforting her by replying that she spent her time helping people and saving lives. Elizabeth expresses her desire to live her last night to the fullest with David, and not sat in her apartment crying about her fate. David very enthusiastically asks Elizabeth what she wants to do. They lay down in bed, and Elizabeth asks David to touch her hand, as she felt his hand when it made contact with her body in the hospital. Just then, Elizabeth says to David that she has realized what her unfinished business is. It's David himself. The next morning, David suddenly awakens and calls out to Elizabeth, worried that she might be gone. Elizabeth, however, is sitting in a chair watching him. David is relieved to find that Elizabeth is still alive, and reveals to her that he believes he was the one who was deceased when they met, and she ended up saving him, so now he's going to repay the favor. Elizabeth is confused, and asks David what he's planning to do, to which David replies that he's planning to steal her body. Elizabeth desperately tries to stop David, telling him that he'll go to prison, though David doesn't care at this point. Elizabeth agrees to help him, but asks him to find someone that can help him, someone that has no morals. David gets Jack to come along with them, not telling him anything in regard to why they're going to the hospital. Elizabeth pleads with David to tell Jack the reason why they're going, though David chooses to keep it a secret. David lies that he has bought a hospital bed, and needs his help to pick it up. Jack is frustrated and asks David if he's been talking to his imaginary friend, obviously referring to Elizabeth, which David denies. Once at the hospital, David breaks into the storage room, and Elizabeth asks him to take some special medical equipment, so they can monitor her body once they steal it. At this point, Jack knows that there is no sale, and that David is up to something. Jack once again asks David what they're doing at the hospital, and that if he really needs the help, he can accompany him to the psych ward. David reveals the truth to Jack, and tells him that they're here to save Elizabeth before they turn off her life support. Jack doesn't believe him. He tests him by asking David if he can prove Elizabeth's existence by calling correctly whether he has rock, paper, or scissors in his hand behind his back. When he's proven she's really there, Jack asks why he's even bothering to risk it all for Elizabeth. David then admits that he loves Elizabeth. She's shocked and touched by his confession. Once the three of them enter the room, Jack is in shock, as he immediately recognizes Elizabeth. Jack reveals that Elizabeth is the girl that David stood up on the night she had an accident. David and Elizabeth are both shocked by the reveal. Elizabeth realizes that she was always meant to meet David. Elizabeth immediately realizes that Jack is also the same ex-boyfriend that Abby kissed on her wedding night. Jack is shocked by David telling him this, as he believed no one knew about that incident, though he is now fully on board with moving Elizabeth's body. Just then, they hear Dr. Brett's voice outside of the room. David, with Elizabeth's help, buys time for Jack to move Elizabeth's body to a new bed. David tries to convince Brett that he is a doctor that has come from another hospital to run some final tests on Elizabeth. Brett, however, tries to call Dr. Walsh to confirm this, but then David drops him with a punch. The trio run away with Elizabeth's body on a hospital bed, though Fran spots this and gives chase. Brett calls for security, who begin chasing the trio, though Jack takes one of them out by tackling him into an elevator, just then realizing that Elizabeth's breathing tube came undone in the process. David carries on alone, though he is eventually surrounded by doctors and security, as Elizabeth's spirit fades as she loses oxygen. David begs for Elizabeth to stay with him, and gives her body mouth to mouth, but ends up being tackled by security. David watches helplessly as Elizabeth fades, pleading for someone to help her. Suddenly, the heartbeat monitor starts beeping again, and everyone pauses. Elizabeth finally opens her eyes as Abby comforts her, and the security unhands David. David approaches Elizabeth, seeing her in a physical body for the first time, tears still in Abby's eyes. David greets Elizabeth, though Elizabeth doesn't recognize David at all. Abby asks Elizabeth if she remembers David, and David tells her about some of the things they've experienced together, but Elizabeth continues looking at him, confused. David reaches for Elizabeth's hand, but she quickly moves it away. Abby asks Elizabeth if she remembers David at all, and Elizabeth shakes her head. David walks away, crushed and heartbroken, glancing back over his shoulder for a moment, but then continues walking away. Some time passes, and David is back to where he started, alone and unhappy. Elizabeth has continued on with her life after waking up from a long coma, and all seems well. Eventually, David moves out of the apartment, and Elizabeth moves back in. Abby and her husband accompany Elizabeth as she moves back into her apartment, and Elizabeth immediately notices that her apartment has changed somehow, but she isn't sure how. Abby and her husband take their leave, and Elizabeth goes up to the rooftop and sees that it is now a complete garden. David is there, sorting something in the garden, and Elizabeth approaches him, asking David if he did all this. David admits that he wanted her to have her garden, and reveals that he has a spare key for the apartment, which he hands back to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is sure she's seen him somewhere before, the touch of memory tingling at the back of her head, but she can't quite place him. Just then, their hands touch, and the memories they made while Elizabeth was in her spirit form come rushing back to her. Elizabeth begins crying, realizing her memories with him weren't a dream, and the two of them kiss. The camera zooms out, and shows the scene inside a snow globe that Daryl is holding. He says the word he's been repeating throughout the film, righteous.